take a film even as fun and silly as Hot Fuzz. That's got some pretty gruesome violence in it at points. A man's head is exploded by a falling church spire. That was rated...
Only a journalist.
Only a journalist, so the humanity is questionable. But still, that would have not have been even probably allowed at all in the 1960s. Whereas when it came out in 2007, because of the tone of it, it was a 15, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, the BBFC has shown a sort of impressive amount of flexibility when it came to tone. Are you familiar with Brain Dead from Peter Jackson?
Yeah, that's pre-Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson, isn't it? I've not watched it, but I'm aware of it.
Yes, it's basically record-breaking for the amount of blood used in a film, culminating in a frankly spectacular massacre by lawnmower. It's quite a sight. But it's also obviously not taking itself seriously, and the BBFC were going to pass that with a 15 because they just said, look, this is obviously a joke. But they were sort of persuaded to go with an 18. You highlighted the sort of aspect of desensitization. I think that is so key in sort of explaining how we get here, how we get from in the 1920s refusing to issue a certificate.
Should we explain how the BBFC works, especially for our American viewers?
We should. That's super important. Yeah.
Yes.
That's like the key thing.
You recommended me to look at the BBFC's website, and they've got a timeline of their history going from the 1920s to today. I was surprised to find that they're technically not a part of the government. Technically, they are an independent, non-governmental body, and those, as we find out day in, day out, tend to be some of the most powerful organisations in the world.
Yeah. I mean, look, we don't ban films, right? This is Britain. We're a liberal democracy. We wouldn't do that. That's authoritarian, right? We wouldn't want to ban any movies.
However, this non-governmental body has recommended that we do not classify this film, which means that most councils won't show it in their constituency.
Nailed it. For anyone who finds that extremely confusing, the process is that we do not ban a film. However, skipping a load of how this was set up, the BBFC is in charge of issuing a certificate to a film which indicates the kind of content that's in it. And the certificates have changed over the year, but they're meant to give you an idea of how extreme it is. And material that's far too extreme would not be included. The BBFC would say, you have to cut this out if we're going to give you a certificate. And if a filmmaker doesn't want to, then no certificate for you. You can still show it, or you can exhibit it in a private members club. That's absolutely fine. Your film isn't banned. But to get the business license to run a cinema, you need permission of the local council. The local council will refuse to allow you to have that business license if you exhibit films that do not have a certificate, or if the council itself has overridden the decision of the BBFC. Basically, it is drowning in bureaucracy, but if they don't want your film to come out, it doesn't come out. But overall, I'd say it's almost a misnomer. I feel like we end up playing into some of the mythology the BBFC likes to tell about itself, where it likes to give the impression that it's a far more censorious organisation than it actually is.
Well, yeah, you've got this book here, which I've not read. We're very smart at the Lotus Eaters. We read books. That's correct, or at least we certainly like to give the impression that we do.
Yes.
And you said when you described that to me before we started that you need to take quite a lot of it with a hefty pinch of salt.
Yes, definitely. That is a collection of essays by mostly academics or people involved with the industry talking about certain aspects of the BBFC's history. And it comes with a lot of bias. You can imagine sort of an academic has a typical perception, and they're mostly writing about the BBFC as some kind of extremely conservative fuddy-duddy organisation. And yet, this is, as I was leading into, this is an organisation that originally started off saying that Snow White was too extreme. Can't be showing that. And now we're in the realm, well, I was going to give Human Centipede Part 2 or a Serbian film as my example, but Poor Things sounds like that needs to be my new example for how on earth is this allowed?
Yes, how on earth is it allowed? And also,
Mm.
why do all of the establishment critics give it 100% and say it's the best film that's ever been made and we should give all of the awards to this? Perhaps
Mm.
it's appealing to some of their sentiments and preferences that they can only express through more artistic means, perhaps, because you can just throw the artistic veneer over it and say, well, now it's got artistic merit.
Yeah.
Perfectly fine. Yeah, I was really surprised to find that in the 1930s, when I think that's when Snow White originally came out, that they said that if you wanted to show it in the UK, it had to have some cuts made to it. Do you know what cuts they asked for?
Off the top of my head, no. I think it's some of the transformation scenes. The BBFC was very sensitive to the idea of how things would affect children. So they tended to be cautious on that. But in the early days, right back in the 1930s, there were only 2 certificates. And there was that is the U Universal, or A for Adult Advisory, however you want to say it. And the operating assumption was still that any film shown should be open to anybody, but films with an A are probably just more adult orientated and not going to be entertaining for children, but they wouldn't really scar them. And then they were letting so much through that the public was a bit upset with this. So this idea that the BBFC is stodgy, conservative, fuddy-duddies, too restrictive, it's already kind of problematized by the idea of the public is constantly saying, you're letting some pretty harsh stuff through. So it's 1931, 1932 when they take the first step of introducing a new certificate, the H for horrific, to say, just so you know, guys, this is probably going to be a bit scary, just so you know.
I think from what I read, that was mainly put on horror films like Frankenstein when that came out in the early 30s.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think they also, for British markets, they had to cut out the scene where Frankenstein's monster drowns a little girl.
Yes.
Which could be quite upsetting for both parents and children to watch in the cinema, even back then. Even now today, the concept of that scene is quite horrifying to think about.
Yeah, totally. There was also a bit that they cut for blasphemy in that, if you can imagine.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't guess anything like that these days.
No, it's a line. The famous line.
Well, actually, I could imagine some blasphemies being censored by the British establishment, but they wouldn't be blasphemies against Christianity. Sorry, carry on.
No, it's absolutely fine. I mean, you've done your research. You're ahead of the game here. But yeah, it's the line is something in the famous scene where it's alive. By God, I tell you, it's alive. And there was originally another bit with the line is something like, "No, I am a god," and they were like, "No, that's going."
Yeah, they certainly that wouldn't even nobody would bat an eyelid at such a thing these days.
But still, it would take 20 years from then until they gave you the first certificate that said effectively, you cannot come into this film below a certain age. So that's the X certificate, which comes in the 1950s. But before that, they were still operating on this idea that everything should be suitable for the general public. I think because of that idea of standards, really, of what is okay to show.
Well, I think we also have to cast our minds back to that time. None of us were alive in that time, but we can recognize through writings and understanding of the attitudes that being a much more religious, or even if less religious, a much more studious country with the standards that we held ourselves to, and especially because I don't think the market for films would have been anywhere near as internationally available as it is today. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Oh,
I know we probably would have had a lot of American films coming through.
Correct.
But there still would have been a lot of focus on the independent British filmmaking scene, I would imagine.
Much more at the time, although one of the big things that put pressure on British cinemas constantly is the foreign import. Chiefly, we've had an American problem in terms of violence, but we've also had quite a French and a Swedish problem in terms of sex and nudity.
Swedish, I'm surprised by. France, not in the slightest.
No, really?
What sort of Swedish films were coming through?
Oh, it's the Swedish films bit is brilliant. I absolutely love it. So I have a second book here. This is What the Censor Saw, which is the memoirs of a very influential secretary of the BBFC called John Trevelyan. he caused quite a few problems for the Bond movies. He did insist on some cuts for them to the point that I think it's GoldenEye, the villain is named Trevelyan, and that's after him.
That's interesting. From what I read, Trevelyan himself came in and somewhat liberalized some of the attitudes, because the BBFC makes a big point in the 1950s when it's talking about that, about Trevelyan came in and he was reflective of the liberal attitudes going through the public at the time, and that's something that you'll notice if you look through all of the BBFC's website about their own history. They will preface any sweeping change that was made to the way that they censored films or the way that they looked at classifications as being public sentiment at the time. This was inevitable. It was inevitable because there was a big public swell of desire for us to lower our standards, to make things a bit more lax. Whereas if you actually look at attitudes when you read somebody like Peter Hitchens talk about it, oftentimes the establishment was far ahead of the public in wanting to lower the standards to make everything a little bit more lax. For instance, I mentioned before we started recording, in Abolition of Liberty, he's talking about drugs, and he talks about the big case where the Rolling Stones members, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, were sent to prison for drugs possession. It was Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, what's his name? William
Rees-Mogg.
William Rees-Mogg. It was his campaign from a headline of the Times to try and get that sentence reduced that ended up getting the sentence reduced, whereas a survey that was done at the time found that British teenagers, the sorts of audience that the Rolling Stones were going for, were saying that not only was his sentence justified, most of them were saying that Mick Jagger's sentence in particular should have been harsher. So the public attitudes, as we can see these days when you look at opinion surveys between the voting bloc, their attitudes being far more socially conservative than the attitudes of the politicians. The establishment is always far more liberal, at least in the post-war period. And then they go back and try and rewrite their own history. Say it was because of this imaginary public feeling that we had to liberalize things. They sort of operate on the logic of, well, we wouldn't have changed things if the public didn't want us to. So the fact that we did change things shows that they must have wanted us to. It's an interesting calculation.
Yeah, and the public didn't kick off too much, so they're they're fine with it. I mean, there may have been an organisation or two with tens of thousands of members who did sustained legal protests, but who cares about them?
Which organisations were they?
I'm thinking of the Mary Whitehouse's National Viewers and Listeners Association. The Festival of Light is another one that gets villainised in the BBFC book, but that's not public attitudes. They're cranks, Harry. They're cranks.
Of course. Overwhelming public opinion is actually just demonstration of the reactionary conservative forces that were trying to hold back progress, inevitably.
But yeah, it's a really great example of how I said, like, understanding the BBFC lets you understand more of Britain. So that exact phenomenon around public opinion is there. By the time of Trevelyan, the defence for censorship has moved away from saying we have firm moral standards, which is there in the earliest days when the BBFC is led by a wonderful man by the name of Thomas Power O'Connor. Power as a middle name. Yeah?
Not bad.
Yeah, I know. He's a very powerful figure, very firm figure. He went into Parliament when they were concerned, like, you're not doing anything. He turned up every year with just a list of things he'd banned films for, which is where you get the... You may see it referred to as O'Connor's 43.
Yes, they reference that on the website, and they have a list of it. One of the ones that I was really surprised by was that they weren't to refer to anything regarding, one, the destruction of races, and two, white slavery, which was remarkable to me, just going back to then, to recognise that, yes, white slavery did exist and was still going on in some parts of the world.
Oh, yeah. They're concerned about it. Insulting the king's uniform. Basically, anything that would be trying to attack the reputation of Britain, that would... they refused to allow films for that.
To denounce the positive effects of the empire as well. Was one of the other ones you had to... If you were mentioning the empire, it had to be in a positive way, because we have standards we want to uphold. We want to inculcate our children into a positive way of viewing their nation, their personhood, because they are a part of a people, all very reflective of completely different times when the British had a lot more of a much stronger identity for who they were. You couldn't just have a piece of paper that said you were British. You came from a strong, distinct culture.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.